Hello again. So we're going to talk about three core concepts. I would say, these are the three things that distinguish science fiction or science fiction and fantasy, from um, normal fiction. Okay, because normal fiction can absolutely involve fantastical elements. Um, uh, in terms of how we need to think about science fiction and fantasy, though, we have to keep these three things like central to how we're developing our stories. And hope this will probably be a bit shorter, if I'm not mistaken. My lecture notes here are only 5 pages. Um, so let's look at this. Okay, so our first concept that we want to look at is this idea of what called the zero world. Now, this is from an article by Darko Suvin. I want to say he's Croatian. I'm not sure exactly. Um, Called "The Poetics of Science Fiction." I'll put that up on the website. Actually, I'll put that up on Moodle for you. It's a good. It's a very formal analysis of the science fiction genre. It does shade off a little bit toward Marxism, although not as bad as some of his other stuff. He was a Marxist. Anyway, if you're a Marxist, that's fine. Let's just be writers instead. So the zero world, we have to think of it like this. When we're talking about exposition, okay, we have to establish the rules of that world. It's like we talked about in lecture 2. What are the rules of our world? What are the baseline? That's what he means by zero here. Like, what are the baseline rules? Is there magic? What are the limits of that magic? Are there technologies? What are the limits of that technology? One way to think about it, and this is, like I said, when we're talking about zero sum games, that's why I brought that up. If you have some kind of magic or power or something, it has to come with a cost. There has to be something taken while giving. Okay? So if your character can do magic, maybe the magic drains their life energy, their mana bar, so to speak, right? When you think about, they do this with some um, superheroes. Let me think. Think about Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility, right? He had this great power and lost his uncle, right? That never left him. He always felt bad about that, okay? So even though he's very powerful, right, it comes with a cost. So you have to think of this balancing act, okay? And that will help you to establish your zero world. So when we're talking about exposition, right, our first, 1 to 2 pages should try, through exposition, through the characters doing things in that world, right? Let's say you have technology like teleportation, okay? You can physically transmit things and people from one side of the world to the other, okay? Now, you could do this in narration. You could slow the story down and say, in this world, there is such a thing as teleportation. It was developed by blah, blah, blah. Or you could just have somebody doing it. Let's take the example. Let's set a scene, okay? Jan sat at her desk writing her science fiction story. There was a zap and a small discharge of ozone. She looked over to the teleportation landing pad. It was her flatmate, Jill. Wow, I just got back from Tokyo. It was great. Blah blah blah. Uh, so much nicer than where we live here in uh, Nassau. You see, what I've done there, I've established several things. First of all, I've gotten the characters. We've got 2 characters. She does not seem surprised by any of this. Okay, so we've established one of our zero world rules, that teleportation is so common, right? That something this amazing is not even thought about. Okay, we've established that it can send somebody from Tokyo to Nassau in an instant, and that this is a very common event. Okay, so very quickly, what we've done is we've established all of these things, okay, by having the characters do the things. Okay, this is the trick to making the exposition in your science fiction stories feel organic. Okay, it doesn't slow the story down to explain all the backstory about how the technology works. It just shows it. Okay, just shows it doing what it's supposed to be doing. So this is the zero world. That is to say that the zero world in your stories for this class are different. They have different rules, even if it's still our world. It still has to be different because it's going to have a fantastical, magical, or science fiction element. Okay, it can be a completely different world. It doesn't matter. The next one is absent paradigm, and I've already kind of established this. Okay, the absent paradigm is basically what we're showing here: how to establish the zero world. Instead of slowing down the exposition in paragraphs and sentences and all of this, instead of slowing down to explain how all of it works, right? You're trusting the reader's imaginations to go along with the ideas that you're throwing at them. Okay, new words, new ideas, new technologies, new magics, whatever. Okay, can be established against the backdrop of the story that you're telling. Okay, so here, once again, like I said, in a couple of sentences, we establish all of these various things. The characters, this character, teleportation is normal, that it can do, send people around the world, that it's so common that you can have one of these in your home, right? Maybe this is just the most basic thing out there. So that's absent paradigm. And that's literally all it is, okay? Subjunctivity comes from, Mark Angino came up with the idea of absent paradigm. Samuel Delany, who is a very, very talented and very famous science fiction writer, gives us the term subjunctivity. And this is how science fiction and fantasy can use language differently. Okay, the example that Delany gives is this: her world exploded. Now, normally in standard fiction, we would read that and think, "Oh, okay, well, it's metaphor, right?" Oh, she got an F on her paper, and oh, her world exploded. Well, in science fiction, this could be literal, right? Her world exploded, right? So this is the idea that Delany introduces in regards to subjunctivity, okay? That because we're using language in a different way, because we have different technologies, different possibilities, it can take on these double meanings, okay? Here's another example. This one I don't think comes from Delany. I think this is mine. She moved mechanically across the room. In normal fiction, okay, that creates something of an image. She's robot-like. In science fiction, maybe she's a robot. Maybe she's an android, okay? That is to say, we're using the subjunctive mode when we're thinking of language and thinking of terminology to create new and interesting possible conditions, okay? All language in science fiction is a bit more charged, a bit more loaded, kind of like poetry, because of the nature of subjunctivity and because of the nature of the genre itself. If we think of a book, or sorry, this is a story. moment. This is from one of the big three science fiction writers in America, or I'm sorry, in English, from the 20th century. There's three: Isaac Asimov, Arthur Clarke, and Heinlein. Heinlein's the big three. Philip K. Dick follows Heinlein, but is very, very, very influential science fiction writer. A lot of his books have been made into movies. We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, I believe, was made into the movie Total Recall. But look at what's going on in this title. Why is this subjunctive? Because when we think of memory, right, we don't necessarily associate that with commodities. Okay, the word or concepts here, wholesale, and we normally don't apply commodity ideas or market value to memory. Okay, this is what he's talking about when he says this expresses the idea of subjectivity. How can one remember something for somebody else wholesale? That is to say, cheaply. Okay. So what he's doing is he's introducing this idea of memory itself, or identity, because what are we but a collection of our experiences and memories? That is introduced in a capitalistic kind of vein, okay, in a market-driven notion. It's a very good story. I think that should be up on Moodle. I believe I put that story up there. If I didn't, I'll have a look and check for it. Okay. So to remember. Zero world, we're establishing the rules and boundaries, definitions, limitations of the setting, characters, etc. That allows us then to understand how far we can go, and the zero-sum values that go into the story itself. The absent paradigm, that is simply to say we are demonstrating through conversation and action what the technologies and magics or whatever, what the fantastical elements are, as early as possible. Usually first pages, second pages. You don't have to list them all out, but you do have to introduce some of them so that the reader understands that we're not in science. We're not in our world. We're in a science fiction story. It reminds me of a story. This wasn't at UB. It was a different university. I had a student who wrote this story about this woman who had a terribly itchy back, so bad it was driving her nuts, and it seemed like it was broadly metaphoric. And I remember talking with her about it, and I said, I don't buy this. I don't believe this. Nobody's back is going to be so itchy that they pass out, as her character did at one point. And she then said, oh, well, later in the story, I'm going to reveal that she's growing wings. And I said, well, that can't be the reveal that happens at the end of the story. That doesn't make any sense. And of course, she didn't listen to me and, wrote her story as she wanted to. I don't care. But there are rules to this. When we're talking about fantasy and science fiction, she didn't want to follow the rules, but, whatever. So yeah, establish that zero world early through things like absent paradigm. And remember that with subjectivity, it allows us to use language in science fiction and fantasy in a much more interesting way, okay? Most of the rest of this stuff, I don't think we need, because that was for... Yeah, that was for a philosophy book that I was reading for a different class. So yeah, those three things right there help us to kind of distinguish or mentally categorize how fiction and science fiction are different. Of course, in fiction, you're establishing setting, but that's more for establishing scene. Because when you're establishing scene like that, you're painting the tableau and making sure that the reader can see where your characters are inhabiting, rather than that gray void when we don't have a well defined setting. Whereas science fiction uses that same idea, just with different effect. Okay, all we're doing there is we're creating scenes and images as we normally would in fiction, just with the added technology or magic or whatever distinguishes your world, your zero world, from our normal world. Okay, Absent Paradigm demonstrates, okay, the technologies are magic by the characters doing them, not the narrator telling us about it. If you think of, for example, a lot of movies will do this, um, and science fiction and fantasy movies, a lot of them will do this where they open up the movie with exposition. Okay, the year is 2055. Humanity is on the brink of extinction. COVID turned everybody into monsters. And then it starts. So it's giving you that zero world. Now, that is not exactly Absent Paradigm, because it's straight exposition as text, right? Some movies, though, skip over that and they jump right in. Okay, there's one good example of it that I can think of off the top of my head. If you've ever seen the original RoboCop movie from the 80s, that movie opens up with a montage of news clips. So we have like newscasters or anchors um, talking about things that are happening in the city, and it gives exposition by demonstrating. Okay, it's a really clever opening. Okay, if you think of the opening of the Terminator, the original Terminator, um, there's only two. You only need to see two, the first and second. All the rest are trash. But the first one is really, really groundbreaking in terms of like style, the introduction of like a new kind of feel to science fiction. James Cameron. I'm not sure will see the new Avatar. The first one I thought was whatever. But he did make Terminator and the movie Aliens, which is two of the greatest. Anyway, the opening of that scene is, and he plays around with time and time, temporal narration, because the scene opens up proleptically. Okay, it opens up in a flash forward of human skulls, right, kind of on the ground, and then a tank rolls over them, and then one of the skeleton Terminators steps on a skull. That is the possible alternative future, and then it jumps back in time to present day. So it establishes several things, right? Establishes the possibilities, establishes seeing into the future, time travel, that Terminators exist eventually in this potential timeline. If Skynet becomes self-aware, and so it's a very complex opening. So, and then we have subjunctivity, which is simply playing around with language, words, terminology. We can remember it for you wholesale. It's a fantastic title, and it does so much. It adds something. It adds something to the world, to the zero world of that story before you've read anything. It does actually do some work in Absent Paradigm because it establishes that that's a possibility. And we get that nice subjunctive overlapping of the connection between memory and commodity. So just keep those three things in mind as you go forward, because a lot of my commentary is going to probably be based loosely around these. Like, oh, Absent Paradigm. Oh, push this, get it more subjunctive. Oh, the zero world needs a little bit more foundation, and hopefully that'll kind of get you thinking as you're composing your stories. So, moving forward, thank you.